On the day before the South African Grand Prix, the Nintendo company launched the Famicom console in the United States. The Famicom, short for Family Computer, had been successful in Japan, but was adapted to look less toy-like for the US market, and was given the name Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, thanks at least in part to the hangover from the great video games crash of 1982 that had led American computers to be wary of purchasing game systems. A few days after the South African race, Emirates Airlines' first flights took off to Karachi and Mumbai. The airline had been set up from scratch in about 6 months under the direction of British manager Michael Flanagan and with huge support from Pakistan International Airways, who provided admin and technical support, pilot training and leased the first aircraft, a Boeing 737 and an Airbus A300. In recognition, the new airline's code was EK for Emirates Karachi. And, a week after the Australian Grand Prix, the first Calvin and Hobbes cartoon by Bill Watterson appeared in 35 US newspapers. The strip was an instant hit, was syndicated all around the world, and ran for 10 years until 1995. Much of the first half of that period was marked by Bill Watterson's struggles with his publisher, who wanted to license the characters for merchandising, something he strenuously opposed. By 1991, Watterson had succeeded in getting a new contract, with total creative control, and to this day no official Calvin and Hobbes merchandise has ever been produced. The 1985 Formula One season would see the first Championship Australian Grand Prix, but this was the 50th race to bear the title. The first Australian Grand Prix was held in 1928, on a track at Phillip Island, Victoria, under the name the 100 Miles Road Race, and was won by Arthur Waite driving an Austin 7. Numerous other venues were used, including a track in Albert Park, Melbourne in 1953 and 1956. By then, the races were beginning to take place on dedicated circuits rather than just country roads or converted airfields, and began to attract more international attention. Jack Brabham won the 1955 race at Port Wakefield, and in 1956, Sterling Moss and Jean Berra lapped the entire field in their Maserati 250Fs. In 1957, the Australian Drivers' Championship was instituted, which was won in its second year by one Stan Jones, father of Alan, driving his own Maserati 250F. Beginning as Formula Libre races, in 1964 the championship and with it the Australian Grand Prix converted to the Australian National Formula, which was renamed Australian Formula One in 1970. A two-tier series including so-called Formula 5000 cars fitted with production 5-litre V8 pushrod engines with pump fuel, and a less restrictive 2-litre category which was discontinued after 1976 in favour of the new Formula Pacific category being introduced throughout the region, which debuted in 1979. From 1982, Formula 5000 was dropped, and in 1983 the Formula Pacific cars became part of something called Formula Mondiale, an FIA attempt to institute a Junior World Series with different regional championships, all sending their winners to a big race-off in Canada at the end of the year. The Pacific zone was won by Charlie O'Brien, and the North American zone by Mario Andretti's son Michael, but no one else seemed interested and the race-off was cancelled. With Formula Mondiale apparently stillborn, attempts intensified to get the Australian Grand Prix added to the Formula One calendar, and a new circuit around the streets of Adelaide was laid out. The 1984 race at Calder was seen as something of a test event and attracted a wide field. Roberto Moreno won the race, beating Keke Rosberg and Andre de Cesaris, with Niki Lauda and Francois Hainaut also entering but failing to finish. Now, the city of Adelaide had a 7-year contract to host a World Championship Australian Grand Prix. Not everyone was entirely keen on the idea of trekking all the way around the world from home bases in Europe for a race that might prove a dead rubber if the championships were both sewn up, and even less at the prospect of yet another temporary street circuit. The teeth-rattling or just plain crumbling surfaces and concrete canyons of Detroit and Dallas had never been popular with the teams and drivers after all. As it turns out, the Constructors' Championship at least was still just about alive, if on life support. McLaren's 10-point lead meant that Ferrari had to win and score with the other car. Fifth would do if neither McLaren scored, while 5 points, a second place or a third and a sixth, would seal the deal for McLaren, whatever the Ferraris did. Thanks to Alan Jones's absence in South Africa, this first Australian Grand Prix would also be his 100th start, so a lot of media attention was focused on Stan Jones's boy as he returned to his homeland even though everyone knew that the chances of him even finishing were pretty slim, and that a point would be a major victory. With much of the big driver and team news settled, there were a number of lasts here too. It would be the last race for the Renault team as a manufacturer, though they had confirmed they would be continuing as an engine supplier for Lotus and Tyrrell, though not for Ligier. The last race too for the Alfa Romeo squad if the very strong rumours were to be believed. If neither Eddie nor Ricciardo scored here, they would be on 0 points for the season, a nadir for the team since its return to the sport. It would also be the last race under their current name for the Tollman team, who would next year be known as Benetton, the clothing manufacturer having upped their financial involvement in exchange for naming rights, and had also secured a supply of BMW engines for the team. And of course, the last race for triple champion Niki Lauda, though of course these things were never certain. He was after all 2 races short of that record with Jackie Stewart's, and seeing him deep in conversation with Bernie Ecclestone, rumours had arisen that he might be in talks to take over from Nelson Piquet at Brabham. Nelson, of course, would be leaving the Brabham team after 7 years, just as Elio De Angelis was leaving Lotus after the same amount of time, and Keke Rosberg was driving his last race for Williams after 4 years. So there was an odd mood in the F1 camp as they arrived in Adelaide, between the controversies over the South African Grand Prix, the ending of some eras, and scepticism about the new track. Much of this was instantly blown away when the drivers got out onto track for their first familiarisation sessions on Thursday. They loved the track. It was fast and challenging, the surface was great, and the locals were incredibly enthusiastic, making Adelaide an instant improvement on indifferent Dallas or Detroit. An end-of-term party atmosphere quickly developed in the pit lane, even as the teams worked frantically to learn all they could about the new track. As expected, the battle for pole was primarily between Senna and the Williams men, as it had been for the last few races, and it was Senna who took the top spot, the only driver to go around in less than 1 minute 20 seconds. He would line up alongside Nigel Mansell, the only other driver to get within a second of him, with Prost and Rosberg both just a smidge over 2 seconds behind Senna on row 2. Alboreto and Sura were 5th and 6th, the Swiss driver out-qualifying his illustrious teammate, with Berger and Tombe separating the 2 Brabhams, as Nelson and Elio De Angelis began their last races with their respective teams from a comparatively lowly 9th and 10th. Johansson and Lauda were back in 16th and 17th, just ahead of Brundle. Streff out-qualified Lafitte once again in 18th and 20th, split by local hero Jones, with the disconsolate Fabi 24th, a long way from pole at the Nürburgring, and behind teammate Ginzani, and Rothengatter bringing up the rear as usual, some 10.5 seconds off pole and 2.2 seconds off Fabi. Elio De Angelis stalled on the parade lap and got away last, making his way back up to 10th for the start. Then when the lights went green, Mansell outdragged Senna off the line and took the lead, with Rosberg maintaining his 3rd place and Alboreto scrambling past Prost into 4th, while Jones stalled and got a push start, heading off in pursuit of the rest. Partway around the first lap, Senna had a go at Mansell, forcing Nigel wide onto the grass, but losing momentum himself, which allowed Rosberg through into the lead. Mansell returned to the track 8th, as Rosberg and Senna pulled out a bit of a lead over Alboreto by the end of lap 1. Behind the number 27 Ferrari were Prost, Berger, Sura, Tombe, De Angelis and Piquet. Mansell's race was run, in fact, as he came in on lap 2 with a damaged gearbox, and was not in a good mood with what he saw as Senna's overly ambitious move. Senna himself, meanwhile, was glued firmly to the back of Rosberg's gearbox as they pulled away from Alboreto, who was now clearly holding up Prost and a queue of traffic behind them. Keke had cast-iron brake discs, unlike Senna's carbon fibre ones, which should last better in the heat, but needed more pressure on the brake pedal, which was starting to pain a nerve on the ball of Rosberg's foot. Moreover, the Williams had the better straight-line speed, while the Lotus was nimbler through the corners, all of which meant that Senna could only close up on the infield section, but couldn't get by as the Honda power told on the long straights. Martini went off, but managed to avoid hitting the tyre barrier, was pushed backwards and back into the race by the marshals, while Chiva retired with yet another engine failure. Brundle came in for a diagnostic check on his ignition, which was stuttering, and Lafitte, shaking his head, came in for a rather chaotic tyre stop, and returned to the track just in time to be lapped by Alboreto and co. In the queue behind Alboreto, Berger, whose rev counter had broken already, had now got ahead of Prost, and the McLaren began to drop away from the arrows, with Sura now on his tail. Further back, Jones was having an absolute flyer and was up to 9th, while Senna had given up trying to stay with Rosberg and dropped back to await developments. On lap 14, Piquet had a fire that was completely missed by the TV cameras, and Elio De Angelis was black flagged for overtaking on the parade lap and finally came in 4 laps later, both drivers ending their long association with their respective teams in less than glorious circumstances. Tombe in the camera car was having a lively midfield battle with Streff in the other Ligier, while Alboreto pitted, which promoted Prost to 3rd, Berger having stopped for tyres, Sura to 4th, Lauda to 5th and Jones to 6th to the delight of the crowd. It was short-lived, unfortunately, as the 1980 champion was in 2 laps later with an electrical malfunction. He would be hoping for better luck next year, and with a full season's development behind him and Ford turbo power. Jones's departure put Alboreto back into the points, while Johansson was still languishing back in 12th. Off-screen, Sura got ahead of Prost to go 3rd, staking his claim for continued employment with Brabham as De Angelis' teammate for 1986, and set fastest lap on lap 23 as he pursued Senna. The TV cameras, trying to watch everything all at once, missed Prost retaking 3rd from Sura as the Brabham's tyres started graining. Having got past, Prost set fastest lap again on lap 26, only for his engine to expire from the effort the following lap while De Angelis was holding forth to an interviewer. So, Sura retook 3rd, with Lauda and Alboreto 4th and 5th, and Streff now up into 6th. Rosberg, meanwhile, had got some graining on his own tyres and eased off, allowing Senna to get the hammer down and close the gap again. As half-distance approached, he was right behind Rosberg, only to put a wheel wrong and have a hair-raising bit of rallycross, getting it back on the track but giving himself more to do and potentially damaging the car. He'd also got a piece of paper stuck in his left side pod, which can't have been helping matters in the sweltering heat. He set fastest lap on lap 35, and by lap 40, half distance, the pair were once again right together and approaching Alboreto to lap him. The Ferrari driver got out of Rosberg's way, but Senna wasn't able to get through before a corner and got stuck behind Michele for half a lap before he could get through. 2 laps later at the final hairpin, Rosberg made an unexpected dive for the pits, slowing suddenly, and Senna's front right wing went flying. This was missed while the Australian coverage was off on an ad break, and when they came back a lap later, no sooner had they played the replay than Senna, on his next go-round, missed the pit entrance and went bouncing over the grass instead. Rosberg, who said later that he hadn't even felt the impact and didn't know anything had happened until after the race, made his stop and passed Senna's damaged Lotus for the lead just as the Brazilian finally made it into the pits on his second attempt, while Sura's Brabham was pushed off with a dead BMW. 25.5 seconds later, Senna was on his way again in 3rd, with Lauda now 2nd after a quiet but excellent race. The Austrian was 30 seconds behind Rosberg, though, with 36 laps to go if he wanted to sign off with a win, and he would probably need something to go wrong with the Williams. And now he had Senna just a couple of seconds behind him and charging, as Lauda was delayed lapping Philippe Streff. Soon the two were running nose to tail. Behind them, Alboreto was 4th and the last man on the lead lap, with Warwick and Lafitte now 5th and 6th, and Capelli running well in 7th in his second Grand Prix. Senna regained 2nd place on lap 49, while Lafitte got ahead of Warwick further back, and both Senna and Lauda were catching Rosberg, but Senna's tyres were already visibly grained at the rear. 4 laps later, Rosberg pulled in for tyres again, and to have a bottle of water poured over him, but his sticking front left wheel nut saw him take almost as long as Senna had for a new nose, and he dropped to 3rd. So at about 2/3 distance, Senna, on dodgy tyres, led Lauda, whose tyres were absolutely fine, and then Rosberg some 12 seconds back and motoring on fresh rubber and catching the pair of them. It was going to be an interesting last third of the race. Senna was holding Lauda up, and Niki was trying to get past, which he did on the back straight on lap 56. If he could now get the hammer down and put some distance between himself and Senna, he could sign off his illustrious career with a win. Unbeknownst to all, Lauda had actually been struggling with fading brakes for a few laps, trying to keep it in a straight line under braking. He rapidly pulled away from Senna, while Rosberg was taking lumps out of the gap in front of him. It was not to be for Niki. His brakes finally got the better of him, snapping the back end out and pointing him into the wall, thankfully fairly slowly, but quick enough to break his suspension, and he was out of the race. He had at least gone out while leading, which befitted the triple champion. So, Senna was back in the lead, with Rosberg still bearing down on him and now visible in the background, as the Renault team's last race ended ignominiously on lap 57 with a broken transmission on Warwick's car, Tombe having fallen victim to the same problem after just 20 laps. With both McLarens out and Alboreto now 3rd, suddenly the Constructors' Championship looked like it might be back on, Senna and Rosberg would need to retire and Johansson move up a few places, but it was definitely within the realms of possibility for Ferrari. Things looked even more promising for Ferrari when Senna suddenly slowed and Rosberg swarmed past into the lead, the Lotus's Renault engine giving up the ghost, retaining just enough function to get him back to the pits, where the team took the cover off to see what was what. He went out again but soon retired for good. Unfortunately for Ferrari, at that precise moment Alboretto's own transmission made a nasty noise and he too was out, and McLaren had their second Constructors' title in a row to go with their second Drivers' title in a row. All of which meant that Jacques Laffite was now second, albeit a full minute behind Rosberg, with Philippe Streff third and Ivan Capelli fourth. If anything happened to Rosberg, it looked like there would be an interesting winner. And when Rosberg peeled into the pits yet again on lap 65, with 17 to go, it looked even more like it. He was in for new boots, having again wrecked his tyres catching Senna and Lauda. Now he had a decent lead, he decided to get some fresh ones on and cruise to the finish. He got out in the lead, still some 46 seconds ahead of Laffite, and with fresh rubber and no need to hurry, he was looking good to sign off his Williams career with a win. Behind the two Ligiers, Ivan Capelli was now the last man on the lead lap, with Berger and Johansson 5th and 6th, Rothengatter still running a fine 7th, albeit 3 laps adrift, with Martini likewise still plugging away an 8th, and Brundle technically 9th, but unlikely to be classified if he made the finish, being over 30 laps down after having to have his spark plugs changed. He was essentially just getting some testing laps in at this point. For the last 10 laps, Rosberg gently cruised around, allowing Laffite to close up a bit, while Streff bore down on his vastly more experienced teammate. Jacques caught up to lap Johansson just as the Ferrari caught Berger, and the two began a battle for 5th as Streff appeared in the background in his pursuit of Laffite. A quick slide by Berger allowed the Ferrari through, and Gerhardt followed this up by going straight on at the next corner. After the cameras cut away, Berger actually got it into reverse and managed to get going again, without even losing his 6th place because 7th placed Rottengatter was 3 laps behind. By the last lap, Streff had caught Laffite, and the two Ligiers were running nose to tail for a fine formation finish. At least that was what Jacques thought. Philippe had other ideas and went for second. Jacques blocked him, trying to calm his young teammate down, but Philippe went for the gap anyway, bashed into the back of the number 26 car, and knocked his front left wheel askew. Rosberg brought his car home untroubled to take the win, the first time in his career he'd won 2 races in a year, with Jacques Laffite second and a rather chastened Philippe Streff managing to persuade his 3-wheeled car home nearly a full lap behind Rosberg, but still third, as he already had a lap on Capelli, who finished a fine 4th in just his second race. Johansson and Berger made up the top 6th, and Rottengatter and Martini and their 2 little Italian teams could be well satisfied with their 7th and 8th placed finishes, when so many other more lavishly funded cars had fallen by the wayside. Streff might decide to keep his crash helmet on, though, next time he talked to Jacques Laffite and Guy Ligier, but the team's excellent finish from 18th and 20th on the grid might help the mood at least. It had been, after all the scepticism, a truly fantastic Grand Prix to end the season on, both in terms of on-track action and off-track atmosphere, and everyone was looking forward immensely to a return next year. Keke Rosberg's win moved him up to 3rd in the table, ahead of the Lotus pair, while Williams also moved ahead of Lotus in the Constructors' table, equal on points but with 4 wins to Lotus's 3. Ligier's fine finish to the year put them ahead of Renault into 6th, while Capelli's first career points were also the first points scored by a turbocharged Tyrrell car. Disappointment on the track for McLaren, but they and Prost were world champions, and Lauda would no doubt have a couple of beers to mark the end of his long career. Tonight there would be a party, and what better place than sunny Australia, and then tomorrow the work of preparing for 1986 would begin anew.